In the next two subunits, we're going to talk about our final consideration issue, illusory promises. What is an illusory promise? Well, an illusory promise is where a promiser really promises nothing. It's a promise for nothing disguised as a promise. Here's an example. Homeowner promises to pay house painter $5,000. House painter promises to paint homeowner's house if I want to, if she wants to. So we have a bilateral contract. The question is homeowner's promise to pay $5,000 legally binding? Naturally, we ask whether the promisee, house painter, suffered a legal detriment, a bargain for legal detriment. Well, what type of legal detriment did house painter suffer? Nothing. House painter promised to do nothing. House painter promised to paint homeowner's house if house painter wanted. That is not a promise. Therefore, the promise is illusory, which means homeowner's promise to pay $5,000 is not legally binding. There are several topics we need to discuss with respect to illusory promises, so we'll break these into two parts. In part A, we will talk about common fact patterns that implicate illusory promises, and then we'll talk about output and requirements contracts under the UCC. Let's look at our first common fact pattern. Mary promises to rent her car to Bob next Saturday. Bob promises to rent Mary's car from her if he needs it. Is Mary's promise legally binding? We have to ask whether Mary's promise is supported by consideration. We ask, what legal detriment did Bob suffer? Did Bob suffer a legal detriment by promising to rent Mary's car if he needs it? And the answer is yes. Bob did suffer a legal detriment. This promise, I promise to do something if I need it, is different under the law than I promise to do something if I want. I promise to do something if I want. There is no limitation on me. It is all subject to my whim alone. I promise to do something if I need is a legal detriment. I must do it. I am legally obligated to do it if I need it. Under the law, this is significantly different. Is it much of a legal detriment? No, but it is a legal detriment. Therefore, Mary's promise is supported by consideration. Bob suffered a bargain for legal detriment. All right, continuing on with common fact patterns, Mary says, I promise to lease the storefront to you for 1 year at $2,000 per month. Bob, the tenant, promises in return, I promise to lease the storefront from you for 1 year at $2,000 per month, but I can cancel at any time with 30 days notice. All right, is Mary's promise legally binding? Well, once again, we have to ask what the promisee Bob gave in return. Did Bob suffer a legal detriment? And the answer is yes. And you say, wait a minute. He promised to cancel at any time. And that looks like it's not a promise. That looks illusory. Well, yeah, canceling at any time does look illusory. But Bob promised to cancel at any time with 30 days notice. Therefore, he has legally bound himself to lease the place for at least 30 days. That is enough. That is sufficient consideration. So, in this case, Mary's promise is legally binding. Why? Because Bob suffered a legal detriment in return. His promise to lease the storefront with his right to cancel at any time with 30 days notice is not illusory. Therefore, it is a legal detriment. All right, the next common fact pattern. Mary promises to lease the store to Bob for $2,000 per month. Bob promises to lease the store for $2,000 per month, but now Bob says I can cancel at any time, no 30 days notice. Well, the question now is, will Mary's promise be legally enforceable? And once again, we ask what Bob gave in return. He gave up nothing in return, right? Yes, I think that is the proper analysis. Bob's promise is illusory, and therefore he did not suffer a legal detriment. But here's the issue. In some circumstances, the court might say that Bob has made some sort of implied promise. Right? Here, he promises to cancel at any time. But maybe, and I'm not sure, it really depends on the court, it really depends on the jurisdiction, but maybe a court will say, well, in that promise, there is also an implied promise that he will give notice to cancel, that he won't just cancel at any time. He has implicitly said that he will give a certain amount of time of notice for his cancellation. If the court implies that promise, then Bob's promise is not illusory. Let's change the fact pattern just a little bit. And this time, Mary makes her promise, and Bob makes his return promise. And his return promise is that he will lease the storefront for $2,000 per month for a full year, but he can cancel at any time with no notice. Now, this really looks illusory, right? Why? Well, originally we said just Bob saying I can cancel at any time looks illusory, but maybe a court will imply a promise that he will give notice. If the court implies a promise that he will give notice, then his promise is not illusory. But this time, when he says I can cancel at any time with no notice, it is really difficult for the court to say, well, there's an implicit promise that Bob will give notice, because he specifically said he will not give notice. Therefore, in this case, Bob's promise is almost certainly illusory. What does that mean? Well, it means he suffered no legal detriment by making the promise, and therefore Mary's promise is unenforceable. Why? It's not supported by consideration. Let's take a look at the UCC approach. From our previous examples, we know that under the common law, if a party makes a promise but reserves the right to cancel or terminate at any time, that promise is most likely illusory. Well, what about under the UCC? Let's take a look at a fact pattern. We changed the fact pattern to involve a sale of goods, widgets. Mary promises to sell 3,000 widgets to Bob per month for a full year. Bob, in return, promises to buy 3,000 widgets from Mary per month for a year, but Bob reserves the right to cancel at any time. Under the common law, this is probably an illusory promise, which means Mary's promise to sell widgets to Bob is most likely not supported by consideration. Okay. Is Mary's promise legally binding under the UCC? Well, let's look at the UCC. Let's now look at the UCC. UCC 2-309 expressly deals with a situation where a party reserves the right to terminate or cancel a contract except on the happening of some sort of event, which is what we have in our situation. Bob reserves the right to cancel at any time. You'll notice that 2-309 says it requires reasonable notification. Therefore, even though Bob says that I can cancel at any time, under the UCC, Bob must give reasonable notification. Therefore, Bob's promise is not illusory. Why? Because there's implicit promise that he will give notification. We don't know how many days, but it will be reasonable notification. All right, now what if Bob says, I can cancel at any time with no notice? We said under the common law, this is almost definitely, almost certainly an illusory promise. Why? Because the court can't imply that there will be reasonable notification. Bob specifically says no notification. Well, how does UCC 2-309 deal with it? I think UCC 2-309 takes a different approach from the common law. Look, an agreement dispensing with notification, that's what we have here. Bob says no notification, is invalid if its operation would be unconscionable. So, how does this affect our consideration analysis? How does this consider our illusory promise analysis? Well, let's look at Bob's promise. Bob says, I can cancel at any time with no notice. The UCC says that that is invalid if its operation would be unconscionable. So, is Bob's promise illusory? Well, I think we can recharacterize Bob's promise as I can cancel at any time with no notice. But if no notice would be unconscionable, then I promise to give you notice. It's not much of a promise, it's not much of a legal detriment, but it is a legal detriment. And therefore, under the UCC, I think that the proper analysis is that Bob's promise is not illusory. And therefore, Mary's promise would be enforceable because it would be supported by consideration. Let's talk about output and requirements contracts under the UCC and how they fit into the illusory promise analysis. All right, remember what an output contract is. An output contract is a contract where the quantity is based on seller's production. So buyer says, I promise to buy all the widgets that you produce, and seller says, I promise to sell to you all the widgets I produce. Is seller's promise illusory? How close is this to, I promise to sell to you all the widgets I want? That would be illusory. Is I promise to sell to you all the widgets I produce as illusory? All right, we'll talk about that in a second. Just to refresh our memories, what is a requirements contract? Well, a requirements contract is where the quantity is based on the buyer's needs. Buyer says, I promise to buy all the widgets I need from you. Seller says, I promise to sell to you all the widgets that you need. Is buyer's promise illusory? Well, probably not. Just based on what we've already talked about, buyer's not saying, I promise to buy all the widgets I want from you. Saying, I promise to buy all the widgets I want from you, that's illusory. But saying, I promise to buy all the widgets I need from you, that is not illusory. Let's look at the UCC approach. Let's look at 2-306 of Article 2 of the UCC. Here you can see 2-306 deals with output and requirements contracts. 2-306 specifically says that output or requirements means such actual output or requirements as may occur in good faith. Because the UCC puts a good faith limitation on the party's output or requirements, it is not illusory. So if I promise to sell all my output to you, all I produce to you, it is not illusory. I'm not saying I promise to sell all I want. I am promised to saying I will sell all my output in good faith, which is not an illusory promise. Similarly, if I'm a buyer and I promise to buy all the widgets I require from you, that requirement must be in good faith, and therefore my promise is not illusory. Now's a good time to review the UCC definition of good faith. Good faith under the UCC has an objective element and a subjective element. What is the subjective element? Yes, honesty and fact. That's the subjective element of good faith. What is the objective element? Yes, that's right. Reasonable commercial standards of fair dealing.